My guess is that you've learned about citations before and that you've used them in your classwork and that you've disliked having to do it a little bit or maybe a lot. But citing your sources accurately is a basic expectation within research communities, and so it's important to get it right. If your citations are sloppy, your work will look unprofessional and people might not trust it. Citations also allow us to give credit where credit is due, which means they help students and researchers guard against plagiarism. At its core, a citation is information that points back to a specific resource. The goal of a citation is to provide the information necessary for you and others to return to the original source. Though the kinds of information you might include in a citation will depend on the citation style that you're adhering to and the type of source that you're citing, the basic building blocks of a citation include author name, title of the work, and for journal articles this means both the title of the journal and the title of the article, date of publication. For books, you'll also need to include the publisher and the publisher location, volume and issue numbers, page numbers, names of other contributors, and finally, the Digital Object Identifier, or URL, which we'll talk more about later. The ways in which these bits and pieces of information come together to form a citation vary by style, and there are lots of different publication and style manuals. In fact, this is not even a comprehensive list. Different disciplines tend to use different styles, and instructors might require you to use a particular format, and academic journals will often require that you use a particular format, so it's always good to ask. Some of the more common citation styles are CSE in the sciences and IEEE in engineering. In the humanities and social sciences, the common styles are APA, Chicago, or MLA. In this presentation, I'll be using APA for examples, but the ideas and concepts will be relevant regardless of which citation style that you're using. Sometimes it can be difficult to know when to cite and when not to cite. After all, there might be lots of different types of information in a paper: facts, ideas, arguments, theories, data, conclusions, and even photos, maps, or other illustrations. Sometimes this information comes from you, and sometimes this information comes from something that you've read. Basically, any time that you're borrowing or leaning on the intellectual work of someone else, you should be citing them, whether you are summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting directly. Otherwise, you are plagiarizing and stealing someone else's work. Knowing when to cite information can be tricky, especially since we're not expected to cite anything that is considered common knowledge. If the information can be found in a general reference source, then it can usually be considered to be common knowledge. Another rule of thumb is that something is common knowledge if you can find it uncited in at least 5 sources. Some examples of common knowledge include historical dates, places, and events, common sayings and proverbs, and basic scientific facts. When it comes to where to cite your sources, this can vary some by style, but in APA and in many others, you use a combination of in-text citations and a reference list at the end of your paper. The in-text citation allows you to identify in shorthand where you found the information that you're sharing, whereas the reference list provides the full citation to anyone interested in tracking down the specific source you've used. What you'll need to include in the in-text citation depends on the circumstances, but at a minimum, be prepared to include the last name of the author or authors and the date of publication, as we see here throughout this article. Citation styles usually have a provision for long lists of authors, and in APA you can shorten subsequent citations by using the first author's surname and then et al., which is a Latin abbreviation meaning "and others." Quoting directly from the source is rare in some disciplines, but if you do it, be prepared to provide a page number as well. So as you might imagine, citation styles will have a rule for just about every conceivable situation you might encounter, so always refer back to the manual for guidance. When it comes to the reference list, this is where you include the full publication details of the resource that you've used. Most manuals and citation styles will have rules that dictate how this part should be arranged, but it's usually alphabetically by author surname, as you see here. So much about citations centers around author names that I want to talk a little bit more about authorship. In the sciences especially, the list of author names might get pretty long, but this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone actually wrote the paper. What it does mean is that everyone contributed to the paper or the research in some way. The order in which names appear means different things depending on the discipline. For example, in mathematics, it's common for names to simply be listed alphabetically, whereas in the life sciences, the first author listed is usually the primary author of the paper and also the lead researcher. Others on the list may have contributed fully to the research or just offered their expertise. For instance, a stats wizard may have only helped analyze the data. The final author position can also be significant, sometimes indicating the scholar whose lab this research was conducted in, even if he or she did not participate directly in a particular study. All of this is important to keep in mind as you're looking for a mentor. As you begin your research, I'd recommend figuring out how these conventions work in your field. Simple internet searches can give you some insight, and teachers and your eventual mentor can also provide guidance. Sometimes it's difficult to determine what you are citing. Is it an article, a chapter from a book, a conference proceeding, or something else? There are lots of different types of sources of information out there in the world, and it's important that you cite them correctly. Citing something incorrectly looks unprofessional and will not necessarily protect you against plagiarism. So before you build a citation, you'll have to think critically about what it is exactly that you're actually citing. It's important to remember that citing a source implies that you have consulted it directly and that you have read it carefully enough that you can make informed judgments about the scholarship. So if you only read an abstract and cite the full article, you are misrepresenting the work you have done, and you might be misrepresenting the content of the article since you didn't actually read it. You might also be tempted to cite your mentor when they tell you about a particular fact or piece of evidence. However, in this case, what you really need to do is cite the published work that contains this information. So make sure you get enough information from your mentor that you'll be able to use a database to track down the original paper. Now let's go ahead and dig in a little bit and actually build some citations. I'll be following the APA style, but much of what I discuss along the way will be relevant regardless of which citation style you are using. Books are perhaps one of the most straightforward resources to cite, so I won't dwell on them too much, but here's the basic reference format and the commonly used citation styles I mentioned earlier. One important thing to keep in mind is that sometimes books are reprinted or a new edition is released that has revised content and different pagination, so you absolutely must make sure that you're citing the edition that you actually consulted. Also, citations following these formats imply that you have consulted a book in print. If you have consulted a book online, citation styles will require additional information. As you can see, different citation styles require different pieces of information when it comes to ebooks, such as a URL, the format of the ebook, such as EPUB file or Kindle file, or the database where you found it, such as ScienceDirect or ProQuest. Sometimes, too, you'll need to include the date on which you accessed the book, and then there is the Digital Object Identifier, or the DOI. Over the past 10 years or so, publishers have really embraced digital object identifiers, and citation styles are beginning to follow suit. A DOI is basically a unique string of numbers assigned to journal articles and other types of electronic documents. As we all know, URLs don't age well, so they're not super helpful in citations when the goal is for someone to be able to consult what you're citing. DOIs, on the other hand, are stable over time, and so they're generally preferred. Now let's walk through how to identify the different pieces of information that you'll need to cite a journal article. In most cases, you'll be able to find most, if not all, of the information you need by looking at just the first page of the article itself. First, we need to list the author's names, which are here. Following the formatting in the reference format that calls for last names and first initials, I will add Fleming and McShay to my citation. Next, I need the year, which is over here in the corner. There's a lot of information packed into this small space, so let's go ahead and zoom in a bit. So here we have the year, which I'll drop into my citation. You'll often find this kind of publication information either in the header or the footer, usually on the first page of the article and sometimes on subsequent pages too. Next, I need the title of the article, which is right here. Notice that we need to follow the capitalization and punctuation conventions provided in the reference format up top. So except for this first one, words in the title should be lowercase, unless of course there is a proper noun. Next, I need the title of the publication, which is Evolution and Development. In the citation, this needs to be italicized. One common mistake is that instead of the journal title, students will include the name of the database that they use to find the articles, such as ScienceDirect or ProQuest. This is a very important difference and a very big mistake, so pay careful attention. Next, I need the volume number and the issue number too, if it's available. Basically, a volume is all of the issues of a particular journal published over the course of a year. Journals don't always specify the number of a particular issue, but if they do, you need to include it in the citation. This one does, so I'll include both numbers with a colon in between them. And then I need to include the page numbers for this article. This article is especially helpful and lists them right here, but sometimes you'll have to flip through to the end. And finally, I need to include a DOI for the article or a URL where it can be accessed. APA prefers DOIs, and this article has one, so I'll pop that into place to finish the citation. Pulling together your citations is very detail-oriented work. It can feel like a drag, and if you're doing a good job, it can take a while. And while it might feel like you won't learn a lot from carefully putting together your citations and reference list, you can use this time as an opportunity to think critically about your sources. Specifically, as you collect information for your citation, consider the author's credentials, who published the resource, and who reviewed it. Also, what level of research does a resource represent? As you prepare your citation, you'll also have to think critically about what type of resource it is. Should you cite the book or just a chapter of the book? Is this a conference proceeding or a white paper? Having a fuller understanding of the author, publisher, and type of resource will help you better evaluate what you've read and integrate it with what you're learning. Pulling together your citations can be a tedious and long process. Luckily, there are a number of ways to partially automate this process, and you'll find these on the Citations, Tips, and Tricks handout. To wrap up, this presentation only covers the very basics of building citations, and most likely you'll need to cite something that we haven't covered. In those cases, you'll need to go straight to the source and consult the citation style manual directly. I've linked to good starting places for each of the most commonly used citation styles here, but remember that most formats publish a manual, and these are really helpful. Citation styles are updated every few years, so remember, regardless of where you're getting your information, make sure that you're using the most up-to-date edition.